Before we get started, please go over to Amazon.com and grab a copy of my book, Education and Justice. If you have an African-American son in public school, you need this book because I teach you the many ways that public schools mistreat African-American boys and what you can do to help your son. So go over there and get your copy immediately. Hello, everybody. I hope you're doing well. I have an extremely important video to share with you today. One of the most important videos that I've done. So I want you to help me get this video out because in the day that we live in, you need to be knowledgeable about the law. In fact, I like to think of it this way. I'm trying to make you all street lawyers. Now, obviously, I don't have the authority to make anyone a licensed attorney, and from what you're going to learn from this video is not going to equip you to become a real lawyer, but a street lawyer, someone who is at least familiar with some of the laws that pertain to us as African Americans. All right, so let's get into it. We're going to go to another screen, and we're going to get started. Black people, learn your rights now. Learn your rights now, okay? So, why am I teaching this? Why am I talking about this? I'm talking about it because of a number of things. But Donald Trump recently sent out this tweet. He also put it on his social media. I think it's Truth Social. He said, "He who saves his country does not violate any law." He who saves his country does not violate any law. It is a repeat of something that Napoleon said. And it's also something similar to Richard Nixon, who said when the president does something, it's not illegal. It doesn't violate the law. So we see here, Trump is trying to expand his already massive power as the United States president. That's what's going on here. And it places every American citizen in some jeopardy. And we know the United States Supreme Court said presidents have absolute immunity for their official acts. And they didn't say what official acts are, so they left it very broad. So this is part of the reason why Trump is saying this. He who saves his country does not violate the law. Now, before we get started with these laws, I got to give you first a disclaimer. This video is informational only. It is not legal advice. If you need legal guidance or legal advice or legal representation, consult a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction. Now, as you see, the title is 30 Laws Every African American Should Know. And this is part 1. I hope to get to at least about 15 to 20 of these in this video. Okay? So make sure you take notes. Hello, everyone. I got great news. The merch is finally here. We've been waiting and waiting, but we can finally begin branding our channel. But we need your help to get our brand out there. If you like what we provide and like what you see, please go to the channel and grab your hoodie, your t-shirt, your mug, and we got more designs and products on the way. Just visit our YouTube channel at the Defiant Lawyers Network. Also, we will donate a portion of each dollar you spend on our merch towards some nonprofit. And remember, as always, stay woke. Now again, why is this video necessary? Simply put, our country is systemically racist. We as African Americans have been dealing with systemic racism via slavery, Jim Crow, etc. since the founding of this country. So we, of all people, we need to know the law. We need to know the law. But that's not the only reason we need to know these 30 or so laws that I'm going to go over. Also because our country elected Donald Trump, who often espouses fascist rhetoric, just like what we just read. Okay? So for those two reasons, we absolutely need to know the law. Now, before I begin, let me be clear. Using these laws to try to fight back does not mean you become disrespectful to police officers on the street corner. African Americans are killed by police at a much higher rate than anyone in the country. So it is not a wise proposition to argue with police officers during a stop that could easily cost you your life. So no, don't fight out there on the street. The time to fight back is in the courtroom, especially when we have a president who responded like this when asked about the lynching of George Floyd.
Let's talk about George Floyd. You said George Floyd's death was a terrible thing.
Terrible.
Why are African Americans still dying at the hands of law enforcement in this country?
And so are white people. So are white people. What a terrible question to ask. So are white people. More white people, by the way. More white people.
So if Trump sounds that, callous after George Floyd was lynched and Mr. Floyd didn't fight back, then that should be a real serious reminder not to try to fight those battles on the street. Wait until you're in court. So let's start with the first section, the constitutional protections that you must know. All right, now we'll get into the first. The first one is indeed the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. Now, let me say this about these First Amendments. So, before the framers of the United States Constitution would ratify the Constitution, they demanded that the Constitution contain the Bill of Rights that protects individuals from the government. Donald Trump is president of the government. So these First Amendments, the first 10 amendments of our Constitution, were put in place to protect us from a government that overreaches. Without these protections, we basically would indeed have a dictatorship, an authoritarian government, a fascist government. With these 10 amendments and the other laws that I'm going to share with you, they provide us some protection. All right, so the very first one is the First Amendment. It is extremely important. All right, the First Amendment protects your right to speak, your right to protest, and your right to challenge the government. Okay, it also has the religious clauses. Okay, I won't get into those now, but you do have the right to be a Christian or to not be a Christian, to be some other religious, follow or adhere to some other religion, or follow or adhere to no religion. All right, the government can't force you one way or another. There is no state religion. There is no religious test. But what I want to focus on is the fact that we have the constitutional right to speak, to protest. All right, the constitutional right to let our thoughts and voices be heard. Now, not all speech is protected, but most is. So if the government says you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't say this or you can't say that, you have a First Amendment right to say most things. All right, because your right to speak, our right to speak as Americans, oftentimes can be crushed and can be limited by a government that's that's overreaching. So remember the First Amendment. It's extremely, extremely important. And also the First Amendment protects the press, right? The media, which is very important in our form of government, in a democracy. All right, so number one, the First Amendment. You gotta really appreciate the First Amendment, okay? Then that brings us to the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment guarantees the right to bear arms, the right to be armed, if you can legally do so. But we know historically the right to own firearms has been selectively applied in America. We, African Americans, for example, we could not own guns. A good book to read on this particular subject is Professor Kara Anderson's book, The Second. It's just called The Second. Anyway, she explains that black people have been denied this right while white supremacists have been armed. And obviously that kept us at a disadvantage. Groups like the Black Panther Party understood the Second Amendment, and it's the reason why the government passed gun control laws like the Mulford Act specifically to disarm them. And we also know that the government basically wiped the Black Panther Party out. Then that brings us to the Fourth Amendment. Very important, very powerful amendment. It protects you from unlawful searches and seizures, meaning the government cannot just search or arrest or detain you without a warrant. That's the general requirement. Before they can arrest you, before they can search you, before they can confiscate your goods, come into your house, etc., they need a warrant. They need a warrant unless there's an exception. Now, if an exception applies, like, for example, exigent circumstances, then they can arrest you. They can enter your home. They can search you if an exigent circumstance exists. And then there are also other circumstances that can cause them to not have to get a warrant to do what they're trying to do. But remember, the general requirement is they need a warrant. You got to remember that. Now, that's not the same as what we call Terry stops. And this is where the police has reasonable suspicion to stop you and to ask you questions. All right. Now, that's taking me a little further than I want to go because the difference between a Terry stop and when they have probable cause to arrest or to search you are two different things. Two different things that I cannot explain in this video. And that's the reason why I said I'm willing to do more in-depth videos if you want me to. Just let me know in the comments. All right. But yes, they can stop you and briefly detain you and ask you questions if there is reasonable suspicion. All right. Otherwise, they need a warrant. If there's an exception, they don't need the warrant. And to get that warrant, they need probable cause. So before I leave this, remember, never consent to a search of your person, your home, or your car. Ask for a warrant. All right? Don't consent. If they ask you whether they can search you or search your car, search your house, apparently they don't have a warrant or exigent circumstances. So don't consent to it. Even if you know you've done nothing wrong, still. It's just as an attorney, I just always tell people do not consent to searches. Now, black communities, and here's why I say that, black communities have long been the targets of illegal stop and frisk policies that violate our rights. So just make sure to remember the Fourth Amendment. But as I said in the beginning, remain respectful when asking about a warrant. Just stay respectful. All right? Now, that brings us to the Fifth Amendment, another extremely important amendment to the United States Constitution. And essentially, it gives you the right to not incriminate yourself. It, in other words, empowers you to close your mouth, not to say anything. And quite often, that is exactly what you need to do. Close your mouth after saying 4 magic words. 4 magic words. What are those words? I want a lawyer. Those magic words. I want a lawyer. And what do you do after that?
Shut up!
You shut up. You don't say anything else. Because if you keep talking, you have now undone the Fifth Amendment, because what you say voluntarily, they can use against you. All right? So you don't have to speak to a police officer without a lawyer present. So you simply need to say the 4 magic words. I want a lawyer. Then be quiet.
Shut up!
All right? Now, the Fifth Amendment also requires that law enforcement Mirandize you before asking you questions when they have detained you or arrested you or handcuffed you or have indicated that you are not free to leave.
You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you.
They're telling you that for a reason. They're telling you that because they intend to use and will use everything you say against you. So take that warning seriously. And do what?
Shut up!
Shut up after saying the 4 magic words. I want a lawyer. Now, some state law does require that you at least identify yourself. Okay? If you're driving in a car, for example, here in Texas, you must identify yourself. All right? So, that is the Fifth Amendment. It's extremely important. Many wrongful convictions have happened because of an abuse of your Fifth Amendment rights. So don't get jammed up disregarding the Fifth Amendment. Now, the Fifth Amendment does something else very important. It gives you due process and equal protection rights when dealing with the federal government, as the 14th Amendment does when you're dealing with state governments. All right? So let's move on. The Sixth Amendment. Let's go back to my screen. The Sixth Amendment is equally important. You need to know all these laws, again, especially when we have a president who believes that whatever he does is legal. All right, so anyway, the Sixth Amendment guarantees the right to a speedy and fair trial. So they can't just lock you up and throw the keys away without giving you your right to a trial. So we oftentimes file speedy trial motions when the government is dragging its feet on getting us set up for a trial so that our client can take his case before a jury. Okay? Also, the Sixth Amendment guarantees your right to an attorney before the government has some sort of adversarial court proceeding against you. The state must appoint you an attorney if you are indigent, meaning if you're poor and cannot afford one. Okay? So just like the Fifth Amendment does what? It protects you or enables you not to incriminate yourself by speaking those 4 words. I want a lawyer. But even if you don't do that, and you should, but even if you don't do that and you are now facing some adversarial court proceeding, they must appoint you a lawyer, whether you ask for one or not, if you're indigent. Okay? So it sort of works with the Fifth Amendment. All right? It's important that you understand how that works. So in sum, you have the right to a lawyer, you have the right to a speedy trial, you have the right to a fair trial pursuant to the Sixth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment. All right? Then that brings us to the Eighth Amendment, which bans cruel and unusual punishment. This law protects people against excessive bail, harsh sentencing, and inhumane prison conditions. All right? The Eighth Amendment is also very, very important. And it's been used in lawsuits against abusive police tactics, the death penalty, and mass incarceration. All right, now, so we've gotten through the Eighth Amendment, but let's keep going. We're still in good time here. Let's move into the second section, which has to do with civil rights. All right, our civil rights. You know, I talk a lot about civil rights on this channel because they are that important. The first one is the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, except as punishment for a crime. So essentially, slavery didn't end completely, it has evolved. And that's why black men have been disproportionately incarcerated because of the exception clause to the 13th Amendment, which allows a person to be basically enslaved, okay, upon a felony conviction pursuant to the 13th Amendment. So it's extremely important that you understand that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in most cases. But when someone is convicted of a felony, then they no longer have the 13th Amendment protection from not being enslaved and not losing their civil rights, essentially. I tell our young male clients all the time, avoid felonies as hard as you can, because the government can use those to snatch all your rights away and basically enslave you. I told one young man that, and he burst out in tears. He didn't know that. All right, so the 13th Amendment, okay? Then there is the 14th Amendment. So much talk has been around the 14th Amendment here lately because of birthright citizenship. And I am still very much adamantly opposed to any sort of changes to the 14th Amendment because it's a slippery slope. And let me show you what I mean. There have been some who've said that African Americans cannot be affected by changing the 14th Amendment because, we've been here so long. But listen, let me tell you something. As a civil rights attorney, yes, generally that's true. But let me use a recent case to show you why that's not absolutely true. So the Students for Fair Admissions, I think is the name of the case. The Students for Free and Fair Admissions, I believe. It was the case that struck down affirmative action. And essentially the United States Supreme Court said you can't use race in admission decisions. Well, we learned just this past Friday night that the Trump administration is now using that case to say you can't use race not only in admission decisions, but also in scholarships, financial aid, awards, hiring, promotions, salaries. You get my point? The Supreme Court can limit its holding in a case to one thing, but when us lawyers are trying to accomplish something, we will stretch that ruling or that holding to achieve the goal that our client wants us to achieve. So in other words, we go right back in front of the court and we make the argument, judge or judges or justices, your ruling is not limited by, for example, admissions. Your ruling is also applicable to financial aid, scholarships, etc. Well, the very same thing can be done with the 14th Amendment if SCOTUS changes the birthright citizenship clause. MAGA could go back to the court, file a lawsuit, go back to the court and say, Your Honor, when you changed the 14th Amendment to deal with birthright citizenship last year or the year before, that was not limited to people who are in the country legally. It also applies to other people. And those other people could be us. And it may not mean any sort of deportation of African Americans, although that could be on the table. But it may affect us in some other way. So folks who practice law never say never. We know better. Because we know oftentimes it just depends on who's on the bench. And who's on SCOTUS's bench right now? 6 very conservative Supreme Court justices. All right, stop listening to these non-lawyers giving you legal advice, who's never, ever practiced law a day in their lives, never studied law, don't know anything about the law. Okay? No. All right, anyway, let's go back. 14th Amendment. So, in addition to that birthright citizenship clause, it also has the due process and the Equal Protection Clause, which is very, very, very important for us. The Due Process Clause, the procedural part of it, requires that the government give us notice before having a hearing, and the hearing is required. They can't just take things from us, take our freedom, take our property before they schedule a hearing and give us notice of that hearing. That's due process. That's the procedural part. There's also substantive due process that I won't get into now. You're also entitled to equal protection under the law. All right, so you ought to be treated the same as everyone else is treated. And that Equal Protection Clause is the foundation of most civil rights lawsuits and civil rights statutes. It's really important. Now, it's limited to state government, but as I explained to you earlier, the Fifth Amendment also has equal protection when you're dealing with the federal government. All right? So it's an extremely important part of the Constitution. Now, I've explained to you also that white conservatives have co-opted and hijacked the 14th Amendment, and they use it against us now. So if anything is being done to benefit African Americans, they will say that it violates the 14th Amendment, which was added to the Constitution to protect us and to give us equality, to give us equity, to give us a fair opportunity. They now use it against us. Okay? It's still very important, but they have been able to convince the court that states should not be able to use the 14th Amendment to do anything to benefit African Americans. And as long as we keep, I want you to hear me on this, it's really important, folks. As long as African Americans, and I'm talking about some, a few African Americans, because most know better, but some listen to pro-black imposters who have convinced some African American men especially to support Trump and MAGA and these white conservatives, and that gives them even more opportunity to treat the law in such a way that it works against us, including reparations. So if we right now, if Trump says, which has a snowball's chance in hell of ever happening, but if Trump said something about reparations, I want to get blacks reparations. Well, let me tell you why it wouldn't get past his lips. It wouldn't get very far at all, because he is the leader of the party who fights reparations, who have co-opted and hijacked the 14th Amendment. So helping Trump win the presidency, or whoever his successor will be, will never help African Americans get reparations. Those are not the people who are interested in giving African Americans reparations. Now, I'm going to do a video on reparations and discuss this more, because I did see that Representative Presley introduced or reintroduced H.R. 40. And that's a good thing. That is a good thing. But obviously she needs political help with that. Political help in terms of getting MAGA out of office as quickly as possible. And in that video that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to discuss, because sometimes the argument is made, well, the Democrats are just as bad as the Republicans when they had the trifecta, which has been very few times, but when they had control of all three branches of the government, they didn't do anything for reparations. I'm going to discuss that. Okay? I'm going to discuss that. And look, where the Democrats are at fault, I'm the first to say it. I'm not a Democrat. And there are some things about the Democratic Party I despise. I'm not a Republican. And there are some things about the Republican Party that I also despise. I'm an independent voter. Okay? But I'll say it again. When it comes to civil rights and African Americans' rights and so on, the Democratic Party for the last 60 to 70 years has been there for the African American community. No question about it. All right, let's go back. I think we're about the point that I want to stop. Maybe let's do the 15th Amendment, and then we'll stop here. And in part 2, I got so much more to share with you, talking about the 30 laws that African American people should know. All right, the last one we'll cover here is the 15th Amendment. And it was granted so that black men could vote. But obviously, we know that Southern states did everything they could to block black men from voting. They enacted and implemented all types of voter suppression laws. I mean, from literacy tests to felony disenfranchisement to grandfather clauses and so on. All right? So we have had this lingering fight with white conservatives over voting. Now, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, and it really helped us so much that we got the first African-American president elected. That's how consequential the 15th Amendment has been, and we got him elected twice. Okay? And immediately after 2012, after he was reelected, SCOTUS gutted key parts of the Voting Rights Act. All right, very important parts of the Voting Rights Act. And to be more specific, they gutted one section which rendered an important section, the section that requires pre-clearance, made it basically ineffective and unenforceable by gutting the other section. Are you with me? So it is an extremely important law, the Voting Rights Act, and we need to repair it. We need to put people in office who will sign into law the John Lewis Voter Advancement Bill. Okay, that is something we cannot give up on. We got to keep working until we get that done. All right? So, those are the laws that I want to cover here. Coming up, I'm going to cover a lot more. A lot more. I'm going to cover the old Ku Klux Klan law. I'm going to cover the Insurrection Act. I'm going to cover the Posse Comitatus law that places restraints on Trump and many others that could really impact us over the next 4 years. All right, so make sure you watch every second of these videos. Your freedom, your life, or that of someone you care about hangs in the balance. Okay? All right, thank you for watching this video. We're going to stop here. Remember, part 2 is coming out. And no matter what they tell you, always remember to stay woke.